and good evening to everyone. I am Dr. Macmillan, and here I am again speaking to you, this time about ivermectin and dissecting ivermectin in COVID-19. For anyone who knows about my research, I have always been focused on autoimmunity in COVID-19. Everything is about the science behind the disease and how we can use science to effectively manage and better protect people from severe COVID-19. So here today, when we speak about ivermectin in COVID-19, I have the pleasure of having with me an international panel all across the world of these wonderful gentlemen. Hello and good afternoon to everyone.
Hi, Philip.
Hello. So we'll start with a quick introduction with everybody, and we'll start with you, Amitav, if you don't mind. Just tell us a quick thing about yourself and where you are.
I am presently in Maharashtra, one of the states which is having a lot of cases of COVID, and I am professor and head of a community medicine, and we are having a field practice area where we have been monitoring the COVID data. We have done some sero surveys also, and I am mostly into academics presently and then monitoring the COVID situation in Maharashtra.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Amitav. And Aaron, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I am a community medicine person, epidemiology. So I just know what's happening in the field broadly. So I'm not in a basic science like you. So
wonderful. That's great, Amitav. That's great. And Aaron, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm in Wisconsin, America, United States. I've got 20 years of experience in pharmacology, sports pharmacology, as it relates to the hypophyseal gonadal axis, and also biomedical expertise. So this was a natural progression for me to dive deeply into SARS-CoV-2 and the pathogenesis and pathophysiology of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. And Shankara, this is not the first time we've seen you.
Hi, Philip. I'm a GP in South Africa. I have a background in the natural sciences, and I'm a frontline doctor treating COVID on an outpatient basis.
Excellent, excellent. So, I mean, this does seem as though it's a strange conversation. And I'm going to start this off by showing you a few things that are relevant in terms of COVID-19 and ivermectin. The first thing I want to show you is what the FDA has said, why you should not use ivermectin to prevent COVID-19. Additionally, the EMA also advises against the use of ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19 outside of clinical trials. And additionally, the World Health Organization advises that ivermectin should not be used to treat COVID-19 it should only be used within clinical trials. That's our starting point. And the question is, why, therefore, is this even relevant to discuss? Anybody want to start off with that?
Sure, I can. I mean, I think if you look at the epidemiological data, the point in time when ivermectin began at a certain society, at a population level, we see cases and deaths drop precipitously. So something is going on that merits further discussion, as you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Any thoughts, Amitav, from your experience in India?
India is a very large country. As I said, it can be difficult to really at the population. They have done some recent studies in AIMS Bhubaneswar. It's a premier institute. They have done prophylaxis, the impact of ivermectin prophylaxis on healthcare workers. So it was mostly case control studies and observation study with its problems. So, but they really found at least 72% protection. So we require more such studies. Otherwise, ivermectin is used and freely available in India, unlike some countries. So I think a lot of people are using it, but we require a proper formalized monitoring and data collection to really know its impact. So it is very difficult to really say anything at the population level at this particular time. But ICMR guideline, the Indian Council of Medical Research, in 22nd April, they have permitted you. They have advised use of ivermectin and home care for mild cases. So that way, it is being freely used all over India. And of course, it would be difficult to say whether 22nd March they gave this guideline, and now within the month the cases are dropping down. But it will be very premature to say whether it's due to ivermectin, because they have done some restriction of movement and lockdown also. So that way it would be difficult to say.
Yes, and Shankara, you've had some real world experience with regards to ivermectin, which we're going to come back to in a bit. But from your point of view, should it be something that's part of the toolbox, or should it be only limited to clinical trials?
Philip, I think it should be part of our toolbox. Cumulative data around the world has shown some prophylactic benefit, yet we don't understand the mechanism around that. As well, it is a very safe medication that's been used in human beings for a long period of time, and we haven't had any safety issues with it. So I don't see the need to restrict its use unnecessarily. If we know that there's benefit to it, we need to investigate that further. Clinical trials are going to stifle its use. We can get research going. We can allow doctors to use it. I don't see any harm in trying.
All right. Okay. So Amitav, I'm going to come back to you here in a second, and I'm going to ask you to speak a little louder. Some people have said that they can't quite hear, so I'll ask you to speak a little louder into the computer and the microphone. But where is India at this point with regards to COVID-19?
India, a couple of months back or a month back, India was having a real problem. But now, since the past 1 month, the caseload has
Amitav, I think your computer is breaking up. Could you just switch off your camera?
Crisis is not so much. Yeah.
Yes, just see if
Yeah.
let's see if we
Can you
get
hear
a
me
better
now?
sound.
So,
Yes, go ahead.
huh. So it was about a couple of months, like beginning of April or middle of April, the things were quite, the crisis was severe in India, with shortage of beds and large number of cases falling sick at the same time, requiring a. But for the past, say, past 15 days, the things have eased a lot. Now the cases are falling as sharply as it had gone up, and particularly states like Maharashtra and some of the other states, the cases are coming down. But being a large country, it is taking time for the overall. But overall, also cases from 4 lakh a day, we are now to 2.6 lakh, around 2.6 lakh in the past 15 days. So that cases are coming down. And as I said, the Indian Council of Medical Research had given in the guideline can ivermectin can be used for home treatment. So ivermectin is freely available in our country, and as Dr. Sethi also brought out that safety issue, we are doctors here are quite comfortable with ivermectin because they have got almost 3 or 4 decades experience treating it for worm infestations and for filariasis. So there have been no major safety issues. So they are quite confident, and the human preparations are also freely available for human preparation.
And
And
so I'm going
they
to
have
bring
been
up.
used.
Oh, go ahead, Amitav.
And as I said, there have been some studies which are, of course, observational studies, and a lot of doctors are using ivermectin among their patients, and a lot of anecdotal evidence are available of its benefit and patient acceptance. And it's been freely, I would say,
I think we've lost you again there, Amitav, but not to worry. I'm just going to bring up here a chart here, Aaron, that you had been involved with.
resilience.
Yeah, you just broke up a little bit there, Amitav. So just hang fire. Probably keep the camera off temporarily when you're going to speak. Just switch off the camera. So, Aaron, I brought up here a post, an image that you've had with regards to the cases in India. The first question that people would ask is, how accurate is this?
Okay, so first of all, let me just say that this is not my data. It's not my chart. I use this from Wan Chami. He's the expert, and he's a data analyst that derived all this data, probably from an API on the back end to one of the Indian reporting agencies. That's how I would guess. So according to one and the FLCCC crew, this chart shows the efficacy of ivermectin on a population-wide level, so that when ivermectin is introduced into a population, cases would fall precipitously after that, not very long after. So that is basically the I guess the message of the chart. But it's his data, or he compiled it, so I don't take any credit in this whatsoever.
No, I understand. And so in basically what it seems to be putting across, that in Tamil, where there is not free use of ivermectin, it is one of the parts of India where cases are rising rather than falling. Is that likely to just be a statistical error?
Well, that's something that somebody might have to decide for themselves. I don't see how that can. Well, it's not just okay. This is not just the states of India. This has happened all across the world. I mean, Mexico, Peru, I believe Honduras or Dominican Republic as well. So this is a pattern that we've seen really beginning since the fall of 2020. So this is nothing in my book. This is nothing new, it should not be unexpected either.
And Amitav,
based upon the pharmacological benefits of ivermectin and the 5 main proposed mechanisms of action.
Okay, yeah, we're going to be coming to that in a little. And Amitav, any thoughts on some of the numbers that are being shown here? It's difficult to judge.
As I said, India is a big country, so different states are in different stages of the pandemic. And of course, the data is fairly robust nowadays because India is testing more than 20 lakh tests per day. The number of tests is quite aggressive. And of course, it would be very difficult to correlate because, as I said, ivermectin is used throughout India. So I am very sure with my informal discussion with my colleagues and junior doctors, they are all taking ivermectin, at least individually as a prophylaxis, and anecdotal evidence are there that people who have been taking, they are getting some protection. And even the general public also, ivermectin is being freely used. So, but we require formal studies to really bring out the efficacy. So it's very difficult. I mean, the picture becomes very hazy. We can only know once the dust settles and we have got a robust data. Because I have got some people who friends, my colleagues who are working in some institutions like jails and other things. They have used ivermectin in a closed population and they have found, they have not published the data, but they have found personal experience. They have found that it gives some protection.
And that's a good point from a practical experience, Shankara, because this is where you are unique, because you have treated over 4,000 patients, of which you've had no hospitalizations, no deaths, no need for supplemental oxygen. And that in itself stands as a testament to what you're doing. Now, part of your protocol was to use ivermectin. How were you using it in South Africa?
Philip, my use of ivermectin was limited to after the 8th day, when patients present with hypersensitivity reactions. Now, I used my knowledge of the use of ivermectin in the treatment of filarial disease to justify its use in the treatment of COVID. I was aware that we're dealing with a hypersensitivity reaction, and I was suspicious that the infiltration in the lungs was mainly eosinophilic. Now, in filarial illness, you see a very similar kind of picture where there's eosinophil infiltration into the lung caused by parasites. Ivermectin was as a drug used because it has the ability to clear this pulmonary eosinophilia. And so from that perspective, I used ivermectin once patients showed clouding in their lung pictures. So yeah, I've used it more from an immunomodulatory kind of perspective rather than an antiviral. However, I must confer with Professor Amitav and Aaron. There's a lot of evidence around the world for its prophylactic use, though cumulative data. But from colleagues in India, I've been getting the same kind of reports. I know a lot of doctors in India that are using it as prophylaxis, and it seems to be showing efficacy.
Now, this is an important point about ivermectin that when I was doing the research around it, I think I'll highlight before I bring Aaron in to give us a bit more with regards to the research. And the important principle that we're looking at today is that certainly myself and Shankara are along the hypersensitivity or autoimmune purpose or reason for severe disease in COVID-19. And most critically, ivermectin, when you look closely at the studies, even when it's dealing with parasitic infections, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of activity against the parasites. What it does is that it somehow allows the immune system to get rid of the parasite. So it does an immune modulatory role, which is quite remarkable and not been seen, I think, by any other drug. So ivermectin is very, very unusual in that sense. And so I'd like to know, probably ask Aaron, in terms of the research that is out there, what are the main thinkings that they have as to the likely reason ivermectin is working? And then we will be looking a little bit more as to why we think from an autoimmune perspective this could be relevant.
Sure. So if you want to share my screen. Yep. So, April last year, the Keeley et al. Study hit, and everybody was like, "Oh wow, 48 hours and this thing clears the virus." And then they took a look at IC50 and said, "Oh well, you'll never achieve that concentration in humans because it's going to be toxic." So, but that's not the important point. The important point here, and we can go back to that. Obviously, I can comment on that further. But it's just this section right here that talks about what happens with these viruses and how they take and invade the nuclear pore complex using the important alpha beta 1 heterodimer. And when they do this, what's the consequence of this? It tends to shut down interferon production. And so this is a key component of innate immunity. And so the thought is that, first of all, people talking about IC50, first of all, we have to realize that cell lines don't have an innate immune system behind them, right? They're just a cell line. Secondly, this study used African green monkey, epithelial cells, not human, upper respiratory epithelial cells. So again, there's a difference in the expression of human ACE2, and they simply don't express human ACE2 whatsoever. So we're not using ivermectin in this case to take and clear, SARS-CoV-2. We're using it to take and free up our innate immunity to do that for us. And so really, again, Keeley could have done a better job at explaining this, but notwithstanding that, we have to go back, and here's the diagram that they used. Here's this heterodimer complex, this important protein complex, and so when the virus attaches to this heterodimer and gets shuttled into the nucleus, then it can take and import viral proteins and basically essentially shut down interferon. So there's a lot of research that has proven this. Here's a great study right here. Previous studies revealed that the viral accessory protein open reader frame 6 of SARS-CoV, which is coronavirus 1 or SARS-1, and SARS-2 is able to inhibit STAT1 nuclear translocation to block interferon signaling. In this study, we report that open reader frame 6 localizes at the nuclear pore complex, where it binds directly with NUP98 or RAE1 complex to target the nuclear import pathway and mediate this inhibition. So the studies have been out there, and here's another one.
Yeah, hold on there a second now, Aaron. Yeah, so I'm going to pause here a minute, Aaron, because this is something that it was this that caught my attention, because when I always looked at ivermectin, I always said my question was always not that it works. My question is why, because whatever mechanism is working is highly relevant to how the disease will function. So the thing that caught my attention, and it was probably because at that time I was looking at how the virus evades interferon, and this is something that most people don't get. The virus is not detected in the first 3 to 5 days. You literally have no symptoms because the virus evades interferon at the nose. It spreads down into the lungs, and that's when the body realizes it's there. That's why it is such a dangerous virus, because the body can't mount an effective interferon response. So when you said that point with regards to interferon production, that triggered off a light bell in my mind, because that's primarily the thing that we need to do to prevent transmission and more serious infection, is to block interferon. I don't know if any of the other guys have any thoughts on this. No?
I would just like to add one more point, though, is that alveolar macrophages can't detect the infection in the upper respiratory epithelium either. So that's another problem that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that to me stood out as an important point. Do you have any? You had there technically 5 points. Which other point would you move on to?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand the purpose of interferons and the role that they play in defending, against external pathogens and contagion. This is super important. Maybe you can talk about that, or I can bring up, a study that was done. This is just like a dual nature of type 1, type 2 interferons. This was published in 2018. Type 1, type 2 interferons essential to both combating virus infection and modulating the antiviral immune response. Indeed, an absence of either the receptor for type 1 interferons and interferon gamma have resulted in increased susceptibility to virus infection, including increased viral replication and reduced survival. So we've known this. This is part of established science, and it's absolutely crucial for people to understand that activating regulatory properties of type 1 and type 2 interferons work in concert with each other to create a balanced immune response that combats the infection while minimizing collateral damage. Probably collateral damage due to cytotoxic T cells. So if we can keep the adaptive immune system out of the picture and just clear this thing with the innate immune system, everyone's going to have a much better outcome.
And so here's a thought, like Amitav, because what he's focusing on now is some of the research that tends to get missed unless people are really focused in on it. So I'm asking a question here now, because this is one of the challenges that people who support ivermectin find is, how do they get these points across that actually make a difference to people who don't necessarily know all of this thing? Is it relevant when you think about it?
In fact, I also may ask a question to Aaron. Actually, he said it's not much of an antiviral. I mean, is it, the doses are very high. So when you give it in the early stage, does it have much of an effect on the progress of the viral infection?
That's an important question.
Or is it only for immune modulation? Or it
Any thoughts on that?
Is that a question to me?
Yes. Any?
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I think if we go back to the meta-analyses that have been done, we get that answer, right? Because if we have ivermectin already resident in tissue that's ready to take and bind that heterodimer complex, then we would expect this to take and be effective. And in fact, we are seeing it being effective. If you look at, this is Tess Laurie's meta-analysis, and she is a blessing to the United Kingdom. I mean, she is an expert and a world-class researcher. This shows, and they even left out Hector Cavallo's Argentina prophylactic study. And if the forest plot is definitive, I mean, look at the relative risk reduction in prophylaxis across multiple randomized or observational studies. You're looking at 80, that's 86% relative risk reduction in prophylaxis. That is stunning.
What I understand it is an antiviral, but not directly antiviral, as Dr. Philip also brought out. By some other mechanism, it's an antiviral. Do I understand that way? That it can be used as a prophylaxis, as an antiviral, not directly killing the virus, but by some other pathway. Well, no,
okay, if you look at this article here, this shows the antiviral benefit of ivermectin directly. This is binding affinities to spike protein receptor binding domain, RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, the main protease, human TMPRSS2. So these are, it shows that it's even better than remdesivir. This is absolute. This is just basic math.
The dose is adequate. I mean, there are some concerns that for antiviral you have to give very high dose. So it is adequate, the dose what we are giving.
And actually, it's an important point, because not everybody uses the same dosage schedule, and this is an important difference. So that's part of the reason why I think that many people are hesitant with the antiviral perspective because they would think that it would mean that you would need higher doses for people who were, say, bigger or more obese. And if you're using one dose across the population and it's still having an effect, how is that explained in the context of pharmacokinetics and just the antiviral property of ivermectin? That's part of the challenge that I think is coming up. When people think about it logically, they think to themselves, it doesn't add together.
Okay, I can make a comment on that. There have been studies done in the past, and a lot of the dosing was done for convenience factor. So they looked at the efficacy against these parasitic infections. Can we just roll out like a 12 milligram tab a dose across the entire populace, right? To take and avoid trying to take and do with whether it's 0.2 mgs per kilogram or trying to calculate in the field, because who's going to take and try to do that, right, against the entire population? It just isn't practical. So they took and dosed basically 18 milligrams, I believe, 36 milligrams, and then there was some other range that was used as well. But in certain people, that was much higher than 0.2 mgs per kg. I mean, it was as high as, I believe, 0.8 mgs per kg. So there is a wide range of dosing safety with this drug, and that's been proven over the years.
Yeah, and I'm not.
And regarding this, and regarding the observational studies and the control and this meta-analysis here, this forest plot, these are different dosing. Everybody followed a different dosing schedule because, look, everybody was trying to figure it out on the fly, right? There was no playbook for this situation. And they just took and just said, well, we're going to try this. We're going to try once monthly, or we're going to try every week, or we're going to try, different schedules at different dosings, and just to try to see what actually worked. And remarkably, it's been efficacious across almost all the dosing strategies.
So here is a chart that I want to show, and I want to ask you your thoughts, Shankara, because you're based in Africa at the moment. So, well, South Africa. This was a study that I stumbled into, and it really did. It got me scratching my head. Here we have Africa, which has probably one of the weakest healthcare systems across the world, and yet we don't see an absolute decimation through COVID-19. How is that possible? This chart actually shows the countries that are using ivermectin in blue, APOC countries, as general population level to prevent some of the main diseases, river blindness and so on, compared to the countries that are in white that don't. And this here chart shows the difference between the two groups. It's how do we explain that?
I think, Philip, we've seen the same kind of difference between countries that use it prophylactically and those that don't across the world itself. There's a lot of studies around that have shown the prophylactic benefit of this, but they are cumulative studies, and so we don't really understand the mechanism. And like Aaron was saying, the dosages have been different around the world. I wonder whether as well the parasitic load has anything to play with the severity of infection. So the use of ivermectin in those countries around Africa might have had some benefit in the COVID pandemic, seeing that a lot of illnesses are endemic there that get treated with ivermectin itself. So I think this has been something that we've seen around the globe, that the countries that use ivermectin have shown some prophylactic benefit. However, we are getting breakthrough infections in some, so the prophylaxis is not complete. I'm not sure whether that is related to dosing or whether it is just that it's not completely prophylactic.
And Amitav, when you look at some of these statistics, I think one of the questions that you have to ask is, because ivermectin is relatively safe, is there any risk with regards to why would there be a hesitation at a population level of using a drug that probably does have some impact? Any thoughts on that, Amitav? No, have we lost Amitav? Yeah, so it was tricky. Yes,
it's not a problem. Ivermectin safety issues are no problem in India. For almost 4 decades, doctors are using it, and people are also have been taking it. So they have no hesitancy as such. The only thing is, once there is a proper studies and proper guidelines, then it can get really formalized. So people are taking it freely here. Doctors are prescribing it. That way, there is no issue. As I said, all the people who are working in the frontline workers are taking ivermectin, and the guidelines are also there. So ivermectin is being freely used. So there is no fear of side effects, and there are no major side effects noted in ivermectin. So
Mm.
in our country, there is no problem of that. Only is that we should have proper data to really work out how much impact it is having. So that type of thing, it is, if something is worked out, a proper follow-up is there, we can have a good database.
But here's the reality. And the truth is that in order to get good data, you need to put in good money. And ivermectin has no financial benefit to anybody doing big data on it. This is a real problem, because why would a pharmaceutical company do it? It would mean, therefore, governments across the world would have to come together and do the studies. I think logistically, I can't imagine how we can actually achieve that. It's good to say, but is that even feasible?
I agree with you. It is an orphan drug. Even the manufacturer, its company has disowned its benefits, so it's difficult that way. But since it's not a very costly drug, I think some people can pool together and do the study. Some NGOs or some people who are really interested, the data
And
can be collected.
And so, Aaron, what is it that has caused the major organizations to think that the data or the studies were not good enough? Because there have been studies, but they have been usually done they haven't been done in the first world countries. The quality of the data probably hasn't been as good, and therefore they are discredited. Is there any way around that?
I honestly, I don't see it happening. I don't think there's a way around it. As far as you can use a Cochrane review protocol to take and use perform a meta-analysis, and that should be the highest empirical evidence possible. If people are going to ignore that, then I really don't know what to say. As far as the safety data goes, I mean, Medincell is a French biotech company. They're actually taking and looking at producing. They've already done an extensive analysis on this. They've had someone publish a report on this. I've got the report here. They're actually looking at using their injectable system to deliver a longer acting depot-related dosing protocol and strategy for ivermectin. So again, just because Merck said it doesn't work or it's hazardous, you have other biotech and pharmaceutical companies coming out and saying just the opposite. We're actually going to start using this, and we're going to take and try to mass market this injectable. And obviously, I have the links to the study. And I can provide those links. Anybody can download this information and read it yourselves.
And any thoughts, Shankara? Can you imagine this being done as a heavyweight, fully blinded study somewhere in a first world country? I just can't see any incentive.
Yes, Philip. I think the pharmaceutical companies are not going to get on board if there's no profit in it. So we were sitting with a real big problem in that we might have medication that's been proven to be very effective, but in trying to prove its efficacy, we're not going to get the finance we need to actually move this ahead. So I think it's going to be left to the GPs on the ground to make some choices. And I think the patients that recover are going to be all our data that we need. Unfortunately, by the time we get good enough data, COVID might be something of the past.
That's a really important point. But can we say that part of the reason of looking at something like this is India has just gone through, or is still going through, a major event in terms of a surge. And the lesson from Wuhan is that if we think that it won't come to us, I think that is not necessarily wise thinking. And so this is why, in that context, especially if we have situations where there are mutant viruses that escape vaccination, we do need to have some kind of safety net where we can reduce the risk of severe disease. Any thoughts?
I'm in complete
Yeah, I
agreement.
think ivermectin will take
Yes.
care of mutants also. I mean, it will have a broad. In fact, I was hearing someone talk that it can be used for other viral infections like dengue and other things which are quite prevalent in our country. So it
Mm.
can we extend the scope can extend also.
And this is the point, is that it's one of the things that I hope is going to come out of COVID-19 is the fact that many of the very serious viral infections, based on the research that I'm seeing, are using a similar mechanism, is that they are triggering an autoimmune response which causes severe disease. So say, for instance, dengue fever in most people is, you get sick, you have aches and so on. But in some people, you get dengue hemorrhagic fever. And the more that I look at
Yes.
what has happened with COVID-19, the more I'm realizing that what is probably happening there is that a similar autoimmune trigger has occurred, which can then go on to cause quite severe disease. And even in things like Ebola, we don't know. The point being is that if there is a way that can modulate the immune system and reduce the severity of the disease, that's absolutely critical. Shankara, in your experience, which patients did you find didn't really respond with ivermectin?
Philip, we have to look at it in view of the biphasic nature of this illness. I used ivermectin in the second phase, but I've had a lot of patients in South Africa who were prescribed ivermectin by their local doctor in the first 7 days. And a lot of them had, we can't call it treatment failures, but they went into the hypersensitivity reaction either way. And I had to repeat the dose of ivermectin after the 8th day in those patients who developed breathlessness. So I'm not confident with the use of ivermectin in the viral phase of the illness. I haven't really established its antiviral efficacy, but I am quite confident with its ability in the immunomodulatory part of this illness, because I've seen good clinical improvement in a very short space of time, very obvious clinical improvement. So I think that the prophylactic use, the data around the world has shown that there is benefit there. From my research and from my treatment with patients, I've seen clearly that there is benefit post 8th day in its immunomodulatory benefits. So I think that those are the two areas we need to look more closely at. From a population perspective, I don't think the vaccine is going to give us the herd immunity that we require. And we need a backup plan when we have these surges. A vaccine is not going to help us through the surges that we have. Yet around the world, we've seen that ivermectin seems to be able to dampen these surges.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in terms of some of the other mechanisms, Aaron, anything else that you would say that would support, I guess, what Shankara is saying is that he's found even when the disease has kicked off in the hypersensitivity or the cytokine storm, ivermectin is actually still quite valuable, which is quite remarkable.
Absolutely. And if you want to take a look at the screen, this is basically the study that's used to confirm that. It's lipopolysaccharide-induced production of inflammatory cytokines. Basically, ivermectin improved mouse survival rate induced by a lethal dose of lipopolysaccharide. In addition, ivermectin significantly decreased the production of tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1, interleukin 6 in vivo and in vitro. Furthermore, ivermectin suppressed nuclear factor kappa beta translocation induced by LPS. So the conclusion, the results indicate that ivermectin may inhibit lipopolysaccharide-induced production of inflammatory cytokines by blocking the nuclear factor kappa beta pathway. So that is basically, in a nutshell, exactly what he has experienced firsthand.
Yeah. And I think that what I had found as well in terms of my research as I was working through this and thinking about it is that one thing was highlighted by James Lundin is that he pointed out that ivermectin also has an impact on fibrinogen levels and brings them down. And I've found that it has an impact on IgG levels. So again, people don't seem to realize that the most important trigger with regards to mortality is the amount of clots that occur inside the little blood vessels in your lung. And anything that reduces the amount of clots is likely to save lives. And so if fibrinogen levels go down, you have less microthrombi. And if the IgG levels go down, you will have less inflammation in the blood vessels and therefore less microthrombi. And so from that perspective, you could see how it could even impact after you've had severe disease. And I think it's some of the anecdotal stories that are quite interesting to listen to. But at the same time, I worry that because ivermectin has been positioned as a miracle drug, we have almost, have we overplayed it, Amitav? Any thoughts on that? Have we made it too big in terms of its position?
I don't think so. I mean, it did not get that universal acceptance to make it that big. I mean, it is being used all right. In some countries, it has been banned, but it never really taken very seriously by the mainstream medical consensus. But as I said, in India, people are using it very freely. But like Dr. Sankara said, he is giving it in severe disease. Unfortunately, here the ICMR only gives it in the early stages. There is a home treatment. So there is no protocol for using it for severe disease in India by ICMR. So I think perhaps we are missing out on that.
Yeah, and this is where I think it's big, because people are not understanding the mechanisms as to how it works. This was part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion, because I realized that if we are focused on it purely from the antiviral point of view, we are missing the most important aspect of how COVID-19 kills people, which is the vasculitic, almost the inflammatory, and anything that immune modulates it is likely to therefore make a difference. Has the world been burnt by hydroxychloroquine, the medical fraternity? Any thoughts, Shankar?
Yes, I think so, Philip. There's been a lot of controversy around hydroxychloroquine, and again, a drug that has antiviral properties and immunomodulatory benefits. And so I think we didn't understand the mechanism of how it works very well. As well, we didn't recognize the biphasic nature of this illness. So a lot of the evidence that came out was a bit out of context because we weren't sure where it was being used, as an antiviral or as an immunomodulator. To come back to the point about ivermectin, I've seen that the wide usage here in South Africa has created some problems. It being touted as this miracle drug, recently it's become more widely available in South Africa. So a lot of people have been taking ivermectin thinking that they won't get coronavirus infection. Now that's caused a bit of a problem in that the mainstay of my treatment protocol was to get patients back on the 8th day whenever they had this reaction. Now what I'm finding with ivermectin is that people take ivermectin and they get this false sense of security that they're not going to get COVID. So when they get illness, they defer treatment. And they tend to present after noticing that ivermectin isn't actually stopping their hypersensitivity. Now that has wasted time. And so I'm getting patients coming in far later than they actually should. So I'm not against the use of ivermectin, but I think patient education is vitally important so that they understand that there's a place for this drug. And it's not the silver bullet that they actually think it is. We've got to make the population understand that, look, even if we use it prophylactically, it doesn't prevent you getting COVID totally. So those patients that actually get ill need to seek medical attention and not rely completely on the use of ivermectin.
That's a very important point, Aaron. And when you think about the the perspective that is being put across, because it does come across as ivermectin being a miracle drug for COVID-19. Is that too strong a term?
Well, perhaps. I think that the most successful clinicians are actually using it in combination, for example, with fluvoxamine and aspirin. And if you look at this chart, this illustrates perfectly on my screen what you just spoke of. We know that COVID is a disease that causes endotheliopathy. This is a disease of the endothelium. And so if you understand what the role of fibrinogen plays in this, von Willebrand's factors, this is exactly illustrating exactly what you just commented on. And the ultimate manifestation, stage 3, are the microthrombi. And that sets you up for macrocirculatory thromboembolic events. And so this is super important to really understand how platelets and hyperreactivity and platelet aggregation plays a role in the disease pathophysiology of this. And there are other mechanisms, for example, SSRIs that can take in and treat this. So it's not just a single medication, but it's best used in combination. And Thomas Perotti talked about this, using it with doxycycline. We know doxycycline is an immunomodulator. We know it inhibits interleukin-6. We know it inhibits type 1, type 2 interferons. So again, that's not appropriate for the early phase, but maybe for the later stage it is. So it's a combination therapy that needs to be followed here. But you have to understand really the driving mechanisms of the actual disease pathophysiology in order to address the pharmaceuticals that can be used to combat this problem.
Yeah, and it's fascinating as I listen to what you're saying, Aaron, and I reflect on the fact that when there was the huge attention on hydroxychloroquine, there were hundreds of studies, literally, millions, billions, I don't know how much was put into researching it. And we nowhere near see the same kind of response with ivermectin. It's almost as if we only had one action, which was we used it, we did one shot with hydroxychloroquine, it didn't quite work out, and that's it. We're never going to do anything like this again with any other drug that doesn't seem as though it fits.
So as far as comparing against hydroxychloroquine, I know people who are actually using them both, because they do have different binding affinities to both the receptor binding domain, the N-terminal domain, the RDRP, and other viral proteins. So it can be used in combination with that. Successfully, it has been.
And it raises one of those points where my personal view was that, as I said, in the immune paradigm, I always knew that hydroxychloroquine is a drug that works in most autoimmune diseases. And again, it does an immune modulating effect. The problem that may have occurred is that if it is used in people who don't have a risk for severe disease, you don't get good results. And so similarly, should ivermectin be, if it is being used more accurately, should it be more targeted to people who we know are more likely to get severe disease rather than the whole population? Because the whole population is not going to have severe COVID-19. It's down to about 10 to 15% that are at risk. Should therefore those at risk people be identified and be using it in a much more targeted way rather than at a general level? Any thoughts on that, Amitav?
That way, I think in India, the thinking is that it is given in mild cases as a prophylaxis. So I think this would be really a different paradigm shift. It would be a paradigm shift in India because they are not considering it for moderate to severe disease.
And this is an important point, is that there is so much confusion around COVID-19 because most people who get the infection have asymptomatic disease or very, very mild infection, very mild symptoms. And so instead of us focusing on the group that is most at risk for severe disease, we are treating at a broad level the whole population. And I would put the challenge that even from the perspective of ivermectin, I would argue that the whole population doesn't need it. It's okay for young people who have no risk factors. They just get an infection, they have no symptoms, and they're okay. We can identify specifically the people who are at high risk: obesity as you get older, high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney disease. That's where we could have a much more targeted approach to its use. Is that an unreasonable perspective?
That should be.
Well, I can comment on that if you care. Basically, I'm not sure if everybody understands this, but the Diamond Princess cruise ship study that evaluated post-convalescent patients showed 50% of those people who had asymptomatic disease actually had permanent pulmonary damage on post-convalescent radiography. So this is an important point that I think really the world needs to really address and say, disease severity is not dictated by symptomology. We have to be aware that phosphorylation in pulmonary tissue can happen within hours. That was just released in December. That study was released in December showing that phosphorylation in pulmonary tissue can take place within a couple of hours of upper respiratory epithelial infection. So again, this is a critical component that we understand that just because, first of all, it's difficult. How are we going to take and identify people who may be high risk, other than comorbidities? Back in December, we knew that interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interferon gamma and VEGF were three critical biomarkers that kind of predicted disease severity. But how do you determine that up front while it's still in the viral replication phase? I don't know how to do that.
Any thoughts on that, Shankara? That's a good point that Aaron said. The long-term sequelae, I think that's a very, very valid point.
Yes. Philip, I found it very difficult to risk stratify as well. I've had young patients that were very healthy end up with severe illness, and I've had very elderly patients with a lot of comorbidities having mild illness. So I think it's very difficult to identify the at-risk population to limit our usage of ivermectin. So I think we're going to have, look, I've used it in the later stages of the illness where people get critically ill. So that's the reason I reserved it for that. We didn't have the availability to use it broadly. So I had to limit the usage to those that progressed into severe illness. But the prophylactic benefits are indisputable around the world. So I think we can limit its use based on the curve of the wave. If we find that we're getting an uptick in cases, then we can start to use it on a broad base on a population level. But otherwise, prophylactically, I think it should be limited to those at risk, like healthcare workers and the rest, that are constantly being exposed to COVID. From a general population perspective, we need to look at the cases and whether they're rising and whether we can cope with that, and then use it on a broader scale to bring those numbers down.
Any thoughts on that point, Amitav?
I think that is particularly that is more feasible, as I said, the healthcare workers and even the frontline workers, the workers who are shopkeepers and those who are coming in contact with people. So, and in our country, that problem is not there. It is freely available and acceptance is there. And as I said, in our country, in India, the late stage or moderate to severe ivermectin is never given a chance. I mean, not recommended as such by ICMR. It's only in the mild cases. So that is, it would require some real change in thinking. If you have really good data, for that we require really good data. Anecdotal may not be accepted at this stage.
And so as we come to the end, gentlemen, what do you think, Aaron, is going to be the outcome of everything? What is your prediction as to what you think will happen with ivermectin's use in COVID-19?
I don't believe there will be any large-scale randomized controlled trials. I think it's going to be up to practicing medical and clinicians to take and evaluate this pharmaceutical possibility and therapeutic and decide what's best for their patients.
And again, you've just said it, Amitav, is that you don't see that without these studies. You would agree. What do you think is going to be the play with regards to ivermectin, even in India? Do you see any change?
Ultimately, we would require some good studies. I mean, at least some quality studies, perhaps after the dust settles and if we get more people from across the world, a lot of case series or personal experience and some observational studies and some RCTs are being done. If more are done, definitely there may be some paradigm shift can occur. I think it may take time. It may not be overnight. And as I said, it may have scope for other viral diseases also. It can.
And Shankara, your thoughts? Where is the likelihood of ivermectin going to be?
Philip, as a clinician, I'm not holding my breath for randomized controlled trials to direct me as to what I need to do. Secondly, it's a safe medication, so I'm confident with using it. I think on a patient-to-patient basis, we gain a lot of experience and figure out where the efficacy is. So I think it's going to be left to the doctor with the patient in front of him to make some good choices.
And yes, gentlemen, I think that this was truthfully quite an intro. This is exactly why I wanted this discussion, is that I knew that we would have a balanced scientific perspective on ivermectin. And I think I can safely say that from a consensus point of view, I think that everybody here agrees that it is beneficial. There's not clarity as to whether or not it's a miracle drug. I would say that probably most of us would say that it is going to be an important part of our toolbox, but not necessarily a miracle drug in terms of COVID-19. The big worry for me is that because there is a hesitation in first world countries to use it, that have high numbers of access to vaccines, other countries may follow suit that don't have access to some of the resources and not take advantage of some of the benefits that could occur with ivermectin. That to me is a big concern, because to me it's one of those drugs that it's a banker. What have you got to lose?
Absolutely.
Exactly true, Philip. There's absolutely nothing to use with trying ivermectin. We've over 50 years of use. I don't think we've had any real adverse effects. We haven't had any deaths with ivermectin. It's been prescribed very widely. So I think we need to be very cautious about the kind of information we put out there, especially coming from governing bodies and from those in the regulatory authorities.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very, very much, gentlemen. I'll ask you to hang on for a few minutes whilst I do this outro. Until we have our next session, which I'm sure will also be interesting, we'll keep you all updated. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.